So welcome, dear colleagues and friends. Today the program of the 68 Now project continues with the symposium entitled Living Newspaper, which is dedicated to the legacy of the Prague Spring today. And it's really my great pleasure to introduce our long-term institutional partners, Transit in Prague, in the Czech Republic, because this symposium is curated by the team of the Transit in Prague. In general, Transit, just several words about the network itself, because this is a network which operates independently in Austria, in Hungary, in the Slovak Republic, in the Czech Republic and Romania since 2002. And this network has a polycentric structure because it's a kind of a collective consisting of autonomous local units collaborating across borders. And basically, in terms of the topicality of our event as such, the very idea of the international is very well reflected in the modus operandi of this network, since it is acting trans-locally as in constant dialectics between local and global cultural narratives. And Transit has been engaged in numerous international projects, including the first Kyiv biennial in 2015, the School of Kyiv. Transit in Prague was launched during the post-communist so-called transition period, aiming to think through the question of how historical experience of cultural resistance can be represented by East Europeans, and how it can be reactivated in the new political, economic and social order. And Transit collaborates with artists in different disciplines, scholars, all kinds of engaged producers, organizing all variety of formats, including exhibitions, debates, publishing books, basically trying to build up a conversation about the future of new internationalism, let's say. And it's also my big pleasure to introduce the director, the organizer and the Czech theoretician Viola, who will in turn introduce our panelists today. He, among other things, is also a co-founder of Transit Display, a resource center for contemporary art, and he has been also teaching contemporary art. He has curated and co-curated numerous exhibitions, amongst which are Manifesta 8, Monument for Transformation, the second Prague Biennial, and many others. And he also has edited and co-edited many books and catalogs. I will probably mention the most famous one, which is Atlas of Transformation, which received 2 international awards in 2011, the one in Zurich for Most Beautiful Swiss Book, and the one in Leipzig for Best Book Design from all over the world. Thank you so much, dear colleagues, for coming to Kyiv and appreciating our invitation. I wish all of us today an exciting exchange of ideas and fruitful discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Vasil Čerpanin, for the introduction, and to VCRC for the invitation to come and for the organization of the whole event. We, together with my colleague Teresa Stejskalová, set up this table as a reaction on the invitation. What brings 68 now, and in more specifically, more particularly, what does it mean in relation with the Prague Spring? That was, of course, part of 68, but 68 event that happened in the socialistic part of the world. I would just very briefly mention few ideas that helped us together this table to actually invite our guests, and my colleague Teresa will introduce the guests. I think that if you look very roughly on 1968, especially from local perspective of the Czech intellectual scene, there were 3, I think, there will be 3 major perceptions of this event. First are, of course, comments of the witnesses of 68. Then there is very strong, for long years it was kind of monolithic interpretation of this event by Czech underground, what was called Czech underground. So it was the unofficial part of the spectra that looked at this event as a kind of, and it was very monolithic. And what is interesting that in 1989, majority of members of the spectra went into the liberal side of the politics. So this view on the 1968 was more or less liberal. And in recent few years, there is a new generation of professors, artists, journalists, activists that look at 1968 from a much more precisely ideological and political view, and we try to resemble some of these voices here. Maybe a very short comment to this idea of living newspapers. We were inspired by, not by an activity from 1968, but by actually another group that was called a group of Elkar. It was a group of, that was a story that was told to me by one Czech artist, Ježková, who makes his research about this subject, and he discovered this today almost forgotten group of workers that organized theaters. And in the theaters, actually they played the theaters for themselves, for their colleagues in the factories, in the 1920s and 1930s, and they picked up selected particular information from the newspapers and then commented on them from their perspective, from the leftist perspective, inside the factory during the working process, even during the working hours. So they were transferring, kind of adapting this news into the live events for their colleagues. So this was an idea why we invited our Berlin guests to reenact certain moments and ideas maybe from 1968.
Hello, my name is Teresa and I work as a curator in Transit, and if you happen to be here tomorrow in the evening, I will show you films and have something to say about, also about 68 and about more kind of marginal or forgotten perspectives on the 1968 by third world students who at that time studied in Czechoslovakia. But at this moment I will tell you something about how this evening or afternoon will proceed and introduce our guests. So now we will have short interventions by each of our guests that will take for about an hour. And then there will be a questions and answers session. Questions from the audience, and we hope to have a discussion with you. So the first speaker will be Pavel Barša, over there. He is a political scientist who in 1980s participated in the unofficial culture in Brno. This is the second biggest town in the Czech Republic, and he participated in the punk scene and were the so-called seminars that took place in private spaces. And after '89, he launched an academic career, and he taught at universities in Prague, Olomouc, Brno, and Budapest. The second speaker will be Viola Ježková, who is a documentary filmmaker. She also teaches at the Film Academy in Prague, and she also works for the Czech radio as the spoken word producer. The third speaker will be Tomáš Hučko, who is a writer, playwright. Also, I forgot to mention that Pavel and Viola live in Prague, but Tomáš is from Bratislava, so he comes from Slovakia, and he also works as a translator. And we invited him mainly because he's the founder and editor-in-chief of a very interesting monthly critical journal called Kapitál. And the last speaker will be Zbyněk Baladrán, who is an internationally known artist At the moment he's having an exhibition in Bilbao together with Anna Ježková, a Slovak artist. He's also a curator and a co-founder and member of Display, which is a collective and gallery space in Prague since 2001, which is dedicated to critical practice. So, the word goes to Pavel Barša. Thank you.
It's okay? Yeah. Hello everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I was thinking about, I was reading the announcement about this event, and which one of the topics is the heritage of 68, legacy of 68, and I was actually not able to, because if you ask the question of heritage, it means that you want somehow to relate to the event, commemorate the event or invoke the event in the name of something. I was not able really to do that because I don't, 68 doesn't really invoke in me any positive connotation, and I decided to tell you why. The only thing I could suggest to you now for this event is to show you what I think was a long-term effect of 68. Of course, mediated by many other factors, contingent and not so contingent, but the main effect, and I think in retrospect, if you look, it's 50 years from 68, the main effect which I see of 68 is the transformation of the European and Western left from revolutionary socialist movement to the left-wing liberal movement or parties, which opened the doors in the last 10 or 15 years to right-wing populism in Western Europe. So, from my own perspective, the reverberation of the event in the 50 years which followed was actually quite negative, and I will try to explain to you why I think so. First of all, I want to distinguish two events which usually are taken together. Usually we say, well, 68, Prague, Paris, and so on and so forth, as if those two cities were somehow, and their events were somehow connected, as if they were at a continuum. So the first thing I want to do is to set them apart and to explain to you that they were actually about completely different things. The events which happened in the spring 68 in Prague and in May 68 in Paris. And also I have to say before that, because I try to make the ride very short, so it will be very schematic, and I will basically make a very stylized account what happened and of the main actors. Of course, the events were very complex, there were many actors, but I will focus on two actors which, in a way, made the greatest imprint on those two events in Paris and in Prague, and I will claim that actually Prague event it can symbolize the last attempt to reform the old left, namely the communist wing of the old left. Roughly speaking, the old left has social democratic and communist wings. While in Paris what happened was actually the expression of the new left. And I will explain why I think we have to clearly distinguish between those two. Okay, so those are two faces of the Spring 68, the old and new left. Now, let's begin with the most obvious thing. What was it about in Paris? Attacks against the welfare state capitalism. For this Keynesian, we don't have time to explain those terms, but basically a welfare state capitalism. I could also add the welfare state national capitalism, which was focused, or the central gravity of that capitalism was the nation state. In Prague, it was, as I said, an attempt to reform an oppressive state, socialism, to make it more human. That's why it's sometimes called, they wanted to establish the socialism with a human face. This was the slogan. Okay. So let's meet the main protagonists of two events: rebellious youth on the one hand, and reformist apparatchiks on the other. In France, students fighting with police in the streets of Paris and other cities, and then roughly in the mid-May, joined by the workers, and there was a general strike in France, and really the regime of the Fifth Republic was shattered. The main actors of the Prague Springs, apparatchiks of various levels of state and party bureaucracy, but also official intellectuals, writers, and journalists. One event emerged from below, the other event came from above, from the bureaucratic structures. The programs, it's clear. Again, it was much more complex. Among 68 May students in Paris, there were Trotskyists, Maoists, and others, but of course one of the icons of the event is Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who at that time was basically anarcho-communist. And it's true that some slogans which made the biggest impact for the image of the Paris event were really anarchistic, like, I don't know, it's forbidden to forbid, or under the pavement, the beach, and many other of this sort. So the idea was, to smash the bourgeois system and to establish, to develop a sort of huge, permissive, pluralistic commune where everybody could fulfill his or her individual dreams and wishes. Reform communists wanted, as I said, to humanize the oppressive state, state socialism, with some elements of bourgeois freedoms, for instance, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, market mechanisms injected into the bureaucratic machine, but the party would still maintain the control of the whole process. That was the idea, nothing more. Of course, there were many people then who came from below, who began to push further. But the original program of Reform Communists of the Prague Springs was this: the party would retain power while allowing a little bit more freedom. Okay, what was the now? What's important? I'm now coming to the point which I anticipated, to put the new left and the old left against each other clearly, to say, and it was clear that the new left actually conceived some of the most important institutions of the old left, such as political parties, both social democratic and communist, trade unions and bureaucratic state, as being as much oppressive as the institutions of the reformist capitalism. Okay? So there was a strong tendency to reject the Soviet system in the East as much as the capitalist system in the West. While the Reform Communists in Prague, they were moving in a completely opposite direction. They were basically trying to make state socialism more bourgeois, to put in some bourgeois freedoms which originally were rejected by the communists. So they were heading to this sort of convergence of the two systems, while the new left students wanted to smash both systems. The last point is that, I don't know how many of your generation know this Leninist taxonomy of the definition, the deviations. We can say, if you use this taxonomy, that Prague 68ers represented the rightist deviation, opening to the bourgeois middle class, while the Paris 68ers represented the leftist deviation. Okay, and now I already anticipated that there was this. We don't have time to talk more about that. Basically what happened in Paris was that students began to protest and fight with the police. Then in the mid-May, Workers joined them, they announced the general strike, but within 2 weeks, suddenly it was over because the trade unions made a deal with the government and with the employers, so-called the Grenelle Accords, and they went back to work. So many students, and this is still one of the interpretation of what happened, is still that students were betrayed by the trade union, especially by the communist trade union, CGT, which were very important at that time. I think it was much deeper than that. It was not only a wrong decision of one actor in the alliance, I think it was this heterogeneity of the programs which was pushing the two movements from each other. We can basically summarize the new left, which appeared on the streets of Paris as having post-materialist values, basically. What they cared about was self-realization, recognition of individual difference, transformation of authoritarian relations in all spheres of life into egalitarian relations, the new kind of relationship between men and women, the new kind of relationship between humans and nature, and so on and so forth. And I think we can characterize it, this is the jargon of social science, post-materialist values, but I think in this particular case it's true that you can say those values are post-materialist, while the workers had basically materialist values. They made the deal because the government and the employers were able to increase the wages and to increase the standing of trade unions in the system. Okay, and that was enough. The workers were interested in the benefits within the system, while the students wanted to smash the system. So I think it was not simply a wrong decision which blocked the possible revolution, but it was basically expression of a very deep difference in their programs. Now, if you look on the two following decades, 70s and 80s, what happened there on the macrostructural level? The Fordist and Keynesian nation-state capitalism was replaced by the post-Fordist and transnational capitalism. Which of the two classes or groups from 68 were winners and losers? The losers were the workers, because that transition worsened enormously the situation of the poor and less qualified straight Western societies, and it enhanced, on the other hand, the winners were actually the former student rebels, right? Because they finished their universities, they launched their careers, and they were fine with this post-national, post-welfare state capitalism, because that opened them chances, to realize themselves professionally. They became successful professionals, administrators, etc. At the same time, many of them actually retained some of their countercultural values, which goes to this term bourgeois bohemians. They became bourgeois, but they also retained some bohemian sides to their. So they were more tolerant to various lifestyles. They were less rigid, less authoritarian, and so on and so forth. That's what the label is about. Now, what it meant on the ideological level, 68ers, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, the mainstream of 68ers abandoned their radically anti-capitalistic program while conserving their criticism of the state, bureaucracy, and also conserving tolerant attitudes to a plurality of life forms and cultures. So we can say, schematically, that they shifted from the anarcho-communist utopia of the late 60s to the utopias of the 70s and 80s, which can be called, utopias of human rights, of civil society, of cultural diversity, multiculturalism, and so on and so forth. Some of them may become neoliberals, but I think what's more important is the group or the category which didn't actually accept the neoliberal celebration of capitalism, but somehow accepted the slogan "There is no alternative," as far as the economic system is concerned. Okay, so they were not, they grudgingly, many of them grudgingly accepted this idea that we have no other alternative than capitalism. So their purpose was to humanize capitalism, which is why I say that they actually want to, that the relationship to capitalist system was very similar to the relationship of Prague dictators to state socialism system. They wanted to make, their idea was capitalism with a human face. Now, we have to go more quickly. What happened to the old and new left since '68? I already actually anticipated a little bit. A little bit only, because I have to add that ex-68ers, or French 68ers, or West European 68ers, many of them actually moved to social democratic parties. Some of them founded green parties or green movement, and within those movements they made this shift from socialism or anti-capitalist revolutionary socialism towards left-wing or social liberalism. The old left's communist wing, it was maybe sadder story a little bit, because actually the occupation of '68 in August 68 augured the collapse of the whole system. It was the last attempt to reform the system, which was crushed by force, and then 20 years later the communist movement lost its influence. On both sides, actually, even some of the protagonists of Prague '68 shifted, as Vít said, shifted from socialism to humanist kind of liberalism or left-wing liberalism. So that means that instead of having the divide and clear discontinuity between the old and new left, since the 80s and 90s, what we have had was a left liberal continuum on which both social democratic parties and Greens have been situated. The effect of this was that less educated and less qualified social stratas lost any representation in the political sphere. And while social democratic parties and green parties began to represent more and more middle classes, educated middle classes, which basically were fine with post-national globalized capitalism. So the sad end of the story is that those abandoned workers began to vote right-wing populists who switched from a sort of far-right racist ideology to much more nuanced, pro-Republican, pro-liberal in some sense, pro-democratic, but very xenophobic ideology. And parts of the success of, not all of course, but significant part of the success of right-wing populisms in Western Europe is caused by the fact that traditional representatives of the workers abandoned the workers. So now the workers, at least significant part of the workers, are voting for the right-wing populist, which was to be demonstrated, I think, and I am ending my presentation. Thank you.
afternoon. What I would like to add to our living newspaper presentation is short or small view into how Czechoslovak radio influenced the Prague Spring or the seven days of invasion. And before I do it, I would like to say that as a documentarist, I work with sources and resources, and they serve as a tracks to the truth of the past. And my question was how to work with them, how to reach them, and how to understand them. And because I have no memories on 68, I was not there, I was not born. My parents, they were not politically involved, so in my family I do not have a heritage of fighters or of descent which would allow me to know personal stories about, which would give me those personal stories. So when I want to relate to this past, I have images and I have sounds, and my question is how to read them. The important question for me, how do we relate to the past? The way how we focus and on what we focus and what do we pick from that and how do we interpret it. And those are very important questions because we reconstruct the past by doing that. And before I go to the radio, I would start with the presence how we can see the heritage of 68 now, concretely in Czech radio. It's the importance of the free speech and freedom of speech, and also the need of this the responsibility of the institution to give the proper information, to show the truth to the audience. And 4 months ago, the heritage of 68 came to be a hot theme again, because the leading of the Czech radio was actually censoring some of the news which were made by reporters, and those news were forbidden because they were criticizing Andrej Babiš, who owns newspapers and is media oligarch. And when those journalists wanted to talk about actually the money which he took from the European Union for his company called Agrofert, and those money were probably taken, those donations were taken to lands which he do not own. And it was a huge money, and they wanted to talk about it, and the leading of the radio forbid that. So there was a big fight because those journalists wrote an open letter, and there were public discussion again about the necessity of freedom of speech and the question of censorship and the questions of this do not belong to I don't know. Because I see your faces that you are doing like, oh, what is there? Well, it was not a part. So the big discussion arose and brought themes from '68 again. And the themes are the freedom of speech and the responsibility of the medias of what we call a public service. And the necessity to tell the truth to the citizens and impossibility to tell the truth to audience because the leadership is already involved politically. How it ended with an open end. The leadership now of the Czech radio that they should be much more aware of how they say that. But we as employees of the Czech radio, we know that this is going on, but they will do it more secretly. But the open discussion, public discussion was very important. And the open letter, just for you to imagine, was signed by 300 employees of the Czech radio, and Czech radio has 1,000 employees. And there was a big fear about signing that letter, and big fear among the employees what could happen if we sign. So this is just illustrations of the similar themes and of the importance of single acting of each of us, of single person, how that is very important, and you will hear it very soon. So now we move to '68, and we try to imagine that the radio was really popular at that time. Czechoslovak Republic had like 14 million citizens, inhabitants, and there were around 9 million in Czech and 4.5 million in Slovak, and 3 million people had already radios, which is a lot. Czech television was owned by 2 million people. But just imagine, we have like 9.5 million people and 3 million of them have radio. And during the '68, when the broadcasting was abandoned or was jammed, was being cancelled constantly. Just 500,000 people owned the radio on wire. Still, the role of the radio was very important, and maybe now I will lead you step by step through those days. First of all, the employees of the Czech radio had to deal with the existence of a propagandist radio, which was broadcasted from Dresden, and we have the historians found that actually this propaganda radio was prepared in Eastern Germany half a year ago already, from the August '68, and they started to broadcast just from time to time. And in '68 they really were broadcasting in August, when the 21st of August they started to broadcast the news saying that Soviet armies are very warmly welcome in the Czech Republic, and that it is very important help, and and that there are funny stories. They wanted to say they are that why this need is why this help is needed. They said that there are people who are neo-Nazis, and that the armies found pictures of Adolf Hitler, and that Prague has to be kind of the nest of neo-Nazis. And it's quite funny, the arguments they are using, and this radio was broadcasted continuously from Dresden. And so the Czech radio had to establish own studios to continue the broadcasting. And what I find very nice when you go through those archives is that they broadcast and they are not sure if somebody is listening. So you hear it a lot in the sentences they are sending into the world, that they are saying, we are here but we don't know if somebody is listening us, and they do this for 24 hours a day during those 7 days. And I think it's good to be in touch with this dimension. What I didn't... okay. Thank you. I have just 10 minutes. I'm sorry, I didn't say so many things. The track I prepared is 9 minutes long, and 1.5 minutes is a Czech national item, and I think I will not play this item, and I have 1.5 minutes more. What do I pick? The important thing is, okay, I will comment on the track, and I will welcome your questions. Maybe you have some associations and we can share later together. To comment the track, I will play to you. I choose from thousands of hours of material from the Czech radio archive. I choose this track to offer you a very emotional connection to people who locked themselves in the radio, were not obeying the orders to stop broadcasting, and invented many funny strategies how to broadcast, and I can tell you them later. And what I find also precious on this, just we are used to images, and in relation to truth, when we have a direct records, we have a feeling of authenticity of the truth. We have a feeling how things really happened. And it works quite differently with the sound, even there is also the direct record. So I would like to encourage you to sense this as a direct record, and maybe to observe what it does to you when you don't have an image and you are listening to this direct record. Yes. So I play that. Oh yeah, there are subtitles, and sometimes they go really fast. So you don't have this. It is different, because when you would just listen.
Would you prefer to switch off the light?
No, actually there is really. Maybe if we could put the sound more up. Oh no?
You can do that on the computer.
I think it's full. So sometimes the subtitles go really fast. I'm sorry for that, but I was thinking it's really important to follow the flow. So don't get disturbed by that.
Horní část Vinohradské křídy je už plná tanků okupačních vojsk. Zatím se blíží k rozhlasu pomalu. Ze střechy rozhlasu bylo vidět nejméně 10 obrněných vozů. Lidé se o ty snaží zabarikádovat pomocí automobilů a těžkých nákladních vozů. Zatím okupační vojska nemají přístup k rozhlasu, ale nevíme, jak ještě dlouho se udrží tato situace. V tomto okamžiku se ozvala ostrá střelba z Vinohradské třídy. Lidé prchají směrem k naší budově před střelbou kulometů, samopalů a vykřikují Dubček, Dubček a my se k ním připojujeme.
Přátelé, v těchto okamžitých se střílíš na dvoře Československého rozhlasu. Myslím, že to budou brzo poslední slova, které nás slyšíte. Přátelé, věřme, všichni prosím vás teď naléhavě, věřme, že skutečně musí zdravý rozum vyhrát. Není možné, aby to nevydrželo tato situace. Věřme, že se podaří zdravým silám u nás i zdravý rozum u těch, kteří nás dneska okupovali vítěze.
Věřme dál socialismus a demokracii.
Pak řešíte střelbu. Vážení priatelia, napriek strelbe a napriek citovému pohnutiu, ktoré všetci prežívame, zachovajte kľud. Jeden jediný život by bol zbytočný v danej situácii.
Chceme socialismus, ale lidský socialismus.
A věříme, že i ten náš socialismus československý přece jen vybojujeme, že nám vydrží. Věříme, teď nám nic jiného nezbývá, než věřit, přátelé, a být klidní a nenechat se vyprovokovat. Verme, že pravda zvítězí.
So this is very, very nicely. this is a Slovak part of the Czechoslovak item. The broadcasting continues. The silence was also presented.
Vážení přátelé, pokud mě ještě slyšíte, prosím vás znovu jménem pracovníků rozhlasu. Nedělejte nic, co by vedlo ke zbytečnému krveprolití. Vyčkejte, až se ozve naše legální vláda, ústavní činitele. Nepomůžeme ničemu v současné situaci tím, že budeme vytvářet barikády, eventuálně další věci dělat, které by vedly ke srážce, která v současné době nemá
žádný smysl. Vedl by pouze k obětem, které nikdo nechce, aby padly zbytečně. Prosím tedy znovu, přátelé, uklidněte se, rozejděte se, nemá to v současné chvíli u nás před rozhlasem žádný smysl. Děkuji vám.
Vážení přátelé, ještě tady máme zprávu skupina vedoucích pracovníků Ministerstva československých i zahraničních věcí. Nás žádá o časté opakování zprávy o nedovoleném překročení našich státních hranic proti vůli vedení státu a strany. Ministerstvo zahraničí Černínský palác je obklíčen. Vysílat už nebudeme asi dlouho, protože před budovou je sovětská pěchota, která již jistě brzy obsadí budovu Československého rozhlasu. Žádám vás jménem svým i všech ostatních pracovníků Československého rozhlasu, abyste zachovali maximální klid. Jakýkoliv odpor proti přesile je naprosto zbytečný. Není to kapitulantství, naše jediná šance je v tom, že zabráníme krveprolití, protože krveprolití nemá vůbec žádný smysl v současné situaci. Zachovejte prosím maximální klid. Právě jsem dostal tady zprávu od kolegy, který se díval oknem. Sovětští vojáci minuli vchod do rozhlasu a odešli asi 20 metrů směrem k Václavskému náměstí. Zdá se, že nevědí, co dělat, shromáždili se kolem svého velitele a vypadají rozčileně. Jsou obklopeni několika stovkami našich lidí, kteří volají Dubček, Dubček, pískají a volají fuj. Sovětští vojáci střílejí do vzduchu a kulky letají v bezprostřední blízkosti našich oken.
Prosím o mimořádnou pozornost. Přečtu vám text prohlášení předsednictva Národního shromáždění Československé socialistické republiky, které je určeno představitelům 5 zemí, tomu Podgornému, Bulglistovi, Gomulkovi, Kadárovi a Živkovovi a předsedům Národních shromáždění těchto zemí. Prohlášení se praví. Předsednictvo Národního shromáždění vyjadřuje hluboký a zásadní nesouhlas s postupem spojeneckých vojsk, které dnes začaly bezdůvodně obsazovat naši zemi. Došlo tak porušení suverenity, které je nepřípustné v našich zemích, v našich vzájemných vztazích. Žádáme vás co nejnaléhavěji, v okamžicích, kdy se na ulici Prahy ozývají výstřely, abyste i dnes vydali rozkaz okamžitému stažení všech vašich vojsk z našeho území. Podepsáno je předsednictvo Národního shromáždění.
The melody you heard, this melody was broadcasted as well during the days just when the editors they couldn't talk. They were just sending this signal as a symbol, we are here, but we cannot talk. Yeah. That's all for now.
Good afternoon. Let me first, before I start, thank the organizers from VCRC for inviting us, and I'm very glad to be here on behalf of a Slovak critical monthly journal called Kapitál. And maybe first I would ask Teresa or Vic to give you some of the issues of Kapitál, so you know a bit what I'm talking about. It's in there. And unlike my colleagues, I will not talk so much about the historical events of 1968 in Prague or France or Bratislava. I want to concentrate on the heritage of 1968, or to be more correct or more precise, on the absence of heritage of 1968 in today's Slovakia. So I want to talk about very, very recent events in my country, and the outcome of these events, and then to say something about the role of media in this time and the situation of Kapitál in this context, and then maybe give some suggestions what we can do about this situation. I'm not very sure how aware you are about the situation in Slovakia in recent 4 months, so I'll give you a very quick summary or short introduction. On February 21st, Slovak journalist Jan Kuciak was murdered together with his fiancée Martina Kušnírova. He was shot in the chest and she was shot in the head. And this event created a very enormous surge in the public because he was an investigative journalist, and before he died he was writing about connections of Italian mafia to Slovak political elite. So in a matter of few weeks, it was about 2 weeks, there was this massive response of the public. It was unseen in the country, I think, since 1989. You see, we are usually not a very protesting country. We don't go into the streets very much, or very often. But this changed now, and the people gathered, first in Bratislava, later in other towns, and in just about 2 weeks it was about 10 to 20,000 people in the square. Then they met every other week, and it was 20, 40, in the end it was about 65,000 people in Bratislava protesting. And there was much talk at the time about some rebirth of civic or civil society, and much talk about the heritage of 1989 and the heritage of 1968. So I want to talk more about what these protests were about and who organized them and what was the outcome, and if really there is any connection to the historical events we are talking about today. Because these things, it was happening in March and April and February, of course people started to call it Slovak Spring. Mainly in connection, of course, to Arab Spring, but also to Prague Spring. And I find this analogy or this resemblance kind of incorrect, so let's see why. For me, both Prague Spring and the uprisings of the same year in France, as Pavel was talking about them, they are phenomena with like very wide social impact, and even though these, like, example, the French events, now they are interpreted as student protests, mostly student protests or protests of intellectuals, and I want to talk about this generational conflict later. Basically, it was a huge social movement with strong involvement of French workers as well. And it was also the case of Prague Spring. It was like a huge movement, and it demanded radical political and structural changes. And as I was preparing for this talk during last weeks, I read a lot of essays by Czech and Slovak and French intellectuals that were written at the time. And if you read these essays, then you can see the discussion going on, and there was a huge discussion on the form of these all-encompassing changes, and it's a discussion of people from very different backgrounds and very different areas. There are, as you said, reformed communists, and there are anti-communists, and there are people like Milan Kundera or Karel Kosík, or it's a huge group of people with different opinions. And there is this fruitful discussion going on. Here I would maybe also maybe aim talk about not only European protests of 1968, but now I recently came back from Senegal, and I learned a lot there about the May 1968 events in Senegal. If you know about, and in Dakar there was also a huge movement in May 1968, student movement with involvement of students, workers, intellectuals, and also there was a lot of magazines and a lot of samizdads being created, and the discussion was very fruitful and very interesting. I recommend seeing into these discussions going on in Senegal. So, is any of these discussions or anything like this going on in Slovakia right now, or was it going on in February, March, April? To do this, or to understand this, first I have to talk more about the structure of the protests and the demands that were put by the organizers of the protests. And when we talk about those demands, this is a very tricky question for me as well. Because in first weeks there were no real demands. Like people were only gathering in the streets, sometimes very quietly with candles and with no real demands. Then later in next weeks, the demands started to take shape. First, people wanted the investigation of the murder, obviously. But the investigation was already underway, and there were investigators also from Scotland Yard and Italian police and international police and so on. So it was kind of futile just to ask this. Then later people demanded our Minister of Interior to resign, and that happened. He resigned a couple of weeks after this. Then people asked or demanded the Prime Minister to resign, and that also happened in a couple of weeks. At this time, when both of them resigned, the situation was quite frustrating, I must say. I visited these protests, and there was already a joke going around in Bratislava, saying like, what are we going to protest against this week? Because it was every Friday. And because there was no real demands to structural changes, only demands to change one person for another person, and this happens very easily, and especially in our country where the Prime Minister resigns but puts his puppet in his place. The Minister of Interior does the same thing, so nothing really changes. And in the end, after like 5 weeks or 6 weeks, the demand was a new election. But this also proved very tricky. I talked to many people in this protest, not only in Bratislava but other cities. And when you ask them, so okay, there will be a new election, who are you going to vote for? And they then usually are silent and very hopeless, because there is really not anyone to vote for. We have this governing party, still quite very strong, and then we have a couple of Christian parties, then parties who go somewhere from neoliberal to fascist to openly neo-Nazi. So there is not really much to choose from. And at this time, it's very interesting the response of this neo-Nazi party and all the media affiliated with them. Also, our Prime Minister, or then Prime Minister, had a say in it. And they all claimed publicly in media that the whole protest is sponsored by George Soros and the money from America. And they called our NGOs corrupted. And I know this will sound very ridiculous here, but they warned people not to come to the protest because it would be a Slovak Maidan. That was really happening in the media. Of course, there was no Slovak Maidan. Nothing of that sort happened. So after these 2 months, and when the protest stopped, the country was exactly at the same point where it was a few months back. So why is this failure here? The failure to come with any structural demand. I'm sorry, this will be a little digression or I want to talk more about the Slovak intellectual elite and Slovak media. If you want to what was this? That's not 5 minutes, right?
5 minutes.
Okay, this says 10 minutes, right? Okay, this will be very quick. So, if we want to understand the Slovak elite, we must understand that we are a very Christian country. We always were a Christian country, and the intellectual elite is Christian, and from the 60s, 70s, 80s, this is a Catholic group of people. So it's also not surprising that these protests are led by this same group of people. And that says nothing against their values, but as it always is the case in Slovakia, it's a very isolated group. That means a group that doesn't lead any dialogue with people of different political values, for example. Or people from LGBTQI community, or Roma people, or disabled people, immigrants, and so on, so on, so on. This whole group of people that organized the protest, their demand was ending the corruption. And the whole movement got a name that is already trademarked, and they have copyright for it. And it's called Zaslušné Slovensko, that means for decent Slovakia. But it's still very unclear what is decent Slovakia, and who is decent and who doesn't belong to the decent people. And this situation can be also very easily mirrored in Slovak media. We have now in Slovakia 3 dailies. They are all neoliberal dailies. Then we have very strong traditional Christian weekly. And then we have several magazines that are dedicated to specific arts, like Film One or Music One and so on. So here comes the Kapitál, and I can't do this in 5 minutes. Yeah, I'll try.
No, not 5. It's already 3.
Okay. We started this journal in 2017, mainly because we felt that something is missing in the media sphere and the whole intellectual sphere of Slovakia. And we wanted to give voice to especially those communities, as I was mentioning, the minorities, because they don't have really a voice in Slovakia. So we started a journal. It's a monthly journal. We were quite lucky that we started a crowdfunding campaign because we wanted to understand if there is any real desire for a medium like this, or if there is no meaning to even start such a project. But there was. We got like 8,000 euros in a month, and then we got state support. So then we started, and after a very short time, we were on social media, internet, very often attacked, or there's big adversity from this group, as I said, the traditional one, to the new medium. We are being called ultra-leftist, neo-Marxist, or stuff like this. I don't even understand what neo-Marxist is, so I don't know how we can be neo-Marxist. All we want to do is bring some critical thinking into the game. And now I will get to the point why I chose to talk about protests at all. Our last issue that was published now in May is dedicated to Marx, because it's 200 years since he was born. And what we tried to do was open a dialogue for the first time with all the other media, with all the intellectuals in Slovakia. So we did a survey, like a huge part of the number of this issue is a survey asking one simple question. what's your attitude towards Marx's heritage, and is it any relevant today or not? So we asked all these people, as I was talking about them, we asked Christian magazines, we asked politicians, we asked artists and intellectuals, and so on and so on. And the response was very disappointing for me. Most of them were either violent or aggressively responding, or were very silent about it, or were ignoring the question at all. And that's like a very simple question. That's just your attitude towards Marx. So there I was. It was a big disappointment for me. I stopped. Okay. So yeah, censorship. Yeah, okay, 1 second. Okay. If you want to know more why I even chose this topic of protest and what are my suggestions, what we can do about it, and what we can do about the youth, and how we are leading this problem in the future, please talk to me and I can tell you more, because I'm running out of time. Sorry. Thank you.
Hello everybody, good afternoon. I would like to show my short film, but before that I read a small prologue to the film. You will not interrupt me because it's at beginning and the end, so it's only 3 pages. Good. And Abigail's Utopia, social fiction. In her introduction to The Left Hand of Darkness, Ursula Le Guin attempts to give a simple explanation of science fiction writings. She claims it is a non-futurological subgenre or sophisticated prediction making, but rather a thought experiment. She writes, "The purpose of thought experiment, as the term was used by Schrödinger and other physicists, is not to predict the future indeed. Schrödinger's most famous thought experiment goes to show that the future on the quantum level cannot be predicted, but to describe reality, the present world. This is the motivation for the writing, an analysis of the present with the use of one's imagination. How to face the historical facts that determine the present, our present, and which can be interpreted in various ways. When we speak of the heritage of 1968, someone born in Czechoslovakia will think of betrayal on the onset of monstrous normalization process. Someone born in what was then the First World will be reminded of the last revolutionary attempts. For a long time, the final efforts to formulate an alternative to the capitalist regime towards a more democratic system of self-governance. Taking nuances into account, we can view 68 as an attempt to improve the socialist regime, to humanize the and democratize it without the necessity returning to private property and market economics. Within our family, 68 is seen as another historical betrayal of our nation. The first took place in 1938 in Munich, where the Western Allies handed part of Czechoslovakia over to Hitler. The second in 1968, when the Soviet Union and its socialist allies directly occupied Czechoslovakia. The narrative of about us, without us, was reproduced within our family, that is the conception of a small nation with its defeatist and weakness complexes. For my family, the blood and tanks in the streets completely erased the ethos of the preceding 20 years of a socialist state and its possible perspective, being replaced with an ostentatious anti-communism and chauvinism, blaming the Russians for everything not going well. This view is still dominant in the Czech Republic today. The second Czechoslovak narrative is more left-wing. The tanks stop a unique experiment, a great chance for the social bloc, discredited by Stalinism. In a state where the market and private property had been successfully decimated, the Prague Spring was finally the right time when the people could take things back into their own hands and build a new socialism with a human face, finally a just regime. In his study for analysis, the Marxist philosopher and poet Egon Bondy, co-founder of the ideological leftist association, attempted to give a more complex explanation of the Prague Spring and the invasion that followed. For Bondy, as a young Marxist, it did not take long after the 48 revolution to rid himself of the illusion that the new socialist regime could have anything to do with the realization of the ideas connected to the emancipation project, the possibility of man's universal and versatile development, the elimination of exploitation or the establishment of self-governing society. His position on the changes that took place at the end of the 60s are also different. In Bondy's views, the USSR and other socialist states had simply replaced a number of capitalist exploiters with a single one, the state. The state, that is the political elite that govern it, becomes the universal employer and universal exploiter of the entire society, using various hidden mechanisms to appropriate social value. Bondy saw most of the social bloc states as having opted for state capitalism. For him, the only state that still offered a revolutionary alternative was China, given Mao's emphasis on self-governance during the Cultural Revolution. His interpretation of the Soviet invasion is simple, that the insubordination of the Prague service elite was punished by the Soviet Union's ruling elite by military action. If the service elite does not follow orders, the ruling elite will simply replace it, which is what happened in the Czechoslovakia in 1968. With this position, all emancipatory or revolutionary ethos of law is lost. Bondy thought that only way to Prague Spring could establish a social democracy and social self-governance is if the initiative were taken over by the masses, creating change from below, from the people. That was not the case. The initiative came from the liberal-minded intelligentsia, which if their renewal process were successful, would simply lead to new class divisions. With Petr Uhl in the ideological leftist association, they criticized the communist activities from the left, trying to create a revolutionary alternative of the development of society. They argued for a conception of socialism built on widely conceived democracy and societal self-governance, but avoiding a liberal conception or restoration of capitalism. Bondy saw similar tendencies in neighboring liberal democratic countries. Assessing capitalist economies at the end of the 60s, he writes that their tendency to monopolize and centralize gradually cancels out the relationships between the subjects originally competing, thus creating monopolies and gradually bringing the free market to the edges of the state capitalism. This moment, says Bondy, creates an adequate political structure which significantly restricts democratic political freedom and covers the elite monopoly as well as it can. The second alternative is that the economist elite, whose influence on the state is indirect, begins controlling the economy directly, as in the case of Trump, Berlusconi, or Babiš today. Cases in which oligarchs become state leaders are all the more common. Liberal democratic institutions are preserved. The people can vote, but their real influence on the crucial affairs is minimal. The analysis of social system that Bondy carried out is quite popular to Ursula Le Guin's view. She was concerned with describing and analyzing the contradictions of self-governing regimes and regimes built on competition and control, taking these ideas further and creating specific laboratory conditions for them within the sci-fi genre. In her novel, Dispossessed, an ambiguous utopia, she describes two planets, essentially two social order thought experiments. The first planet, Uras, has a developed market and abundance of consumer goods, technological innovations and comfort, but all this comes at the cost of permanent oppression, exploitation, and the creation of military conflict. The population of the second planet, Anares, created an anarcho-communist society in which everything is formed by the collective, a disciplined society where everything is subordinate to the higher ideas of egalitarianism and justice. This, in turn, comes at the cost of hunger, discomfort, the impossibility of individual development, and certain exhausted apathy. The book curiously compresses two life experiences. Experience of life in real socialism and real capitalism. It does a good job of describing how difficult it is to communicate these experiences and share problems. Conflicts of actions which are incomprehensible or difficult to translate for someone from the other regime, yet completely clear for the reader. To use a metaphor from the book, today we all live in Uras. Anares was completely absorbed by expanding capital, and experience of the Anaresians was discredited. I, an ex-Anaresian who has not yet entirely negated the Anaresian in me, like parents did, I keep the Anaresian ideas in my culture products, such as my writings or films. Both Le Guin and Bondy had no doubts that socialism is another historical era which must succeed capitalism. The restoration of capitalism we have seen in Eastern Europe over the last 30 years does not seem to suggest that anything of the sort is on its way, but despite of grim prospect. I would like to believe, because the only alternative to something I call very vaguely socialism is the death of the planet. We will now proceed to a short video essay titled Social Fiction from 2005. It's my early attempt to deal with the history of real socialism and the
metaphors can create reality for us.
Not yet. Restoration of capitalism in Central Europe. It deals with the contradiction of the post-communist world and the description of revolution as an imperative of the eternal return. Perhaps it comes out anachronistic, and perhaps it describes reality insufficiently. Just like today, both Bondy's Trotskyist Maoism and Leguin anarchist beliefs seems a little dated. We live in an era in which political ideas seems more like thought experiments than a real political force, but that too can soon change. We cannot break this, but we know it will happen.
Would you prefer to switch off the lights, please?
Metaphors can create reality for us. I first thought that the Communist Manifesto could be a horizon that emerged from the past to show us the future, despite the fact that we have had first-hand experience of the tragic failure of communism. I like the idea that all responsibility is revolutionary because it attempts to do the impossible, to interrupt the order of things on the basis of events that cannot be planned. A revolution cannot be planned. In a certain way, it surpasses any possible horizon, any horizon possible, including the horizon of power and force. Recalculation is a way of interpreting a new age. An analogous age culminated with enlightenment and the development of celluloid film. A digital calculator easily refutes it. The specter of revolution hovers over the ruins of a transformed world, like the remorse of abandoned ideals. A utopian society was within reach, from minimum dwelling as conditions for the right life for everyone, to allotted prefab housing, back to housing depending on mortgages. Paradise is postponed another 20 years. The golden age ended. We no longer expect the advent of a just society. If a person wants to pass through an open door successfully, he must assume that it has a firm frame. This principle is the requirement of a sense for reality. If there exists a sense for reality, there must also exist something that can be called a sense for possibility. Functionalist architect Karel Honzík wrote books in the 1960s on the perfect society, highly imaginative descriptions of non-existing advanced civilizations. His unfulfilled architectural vision materialized in the form of descriptions of extraterrestrial worlds, perfect societies, creatures that looked like us, that went through the same evolutionary process as us, except that their initial stage was not that of an ape, but of a squirrel. Their society is classless. There exists no private ownership, no seat of government, just self-governing human centers equipped with self-sufficient production equipment. There are no wars. Honzík states that highly organized life forms, such as thinking man, must arrive at Marxism anywhere in the universe. He calls it convergence in the development of cosmic matter. The construction of a better world begins on the ruins of an obsolete culture. A 1986 film was shot as work safety training in demolishing buildings. It shows how to get rid of old buildings without injury. It's important that during such activities no one is injured or dies. This is why work procedure rules and plans were drawn up. Precisely 10 years before that, a secret agent of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic returned home from West Germany and declared at a press conference, "The mission that I had in Munich was fully justified by the defense of the interests of socialism worldwide." His plan to blow up the Radio Free Europe radio station was deemed too risky by his superiors, since it would damage the reputation of a peace-loving country. Destruction is a condition of change. One of the forms of destruction is forgetting. Yet this is also a general principle of the self-motion of human life. Our memory is merciful and does not allow us to remember everything in detail. The Communist Manifesto deals with destruction in detail. Capitalism appalls in that it's nearly impossible to get off its merry-go-round. Fragmentary perceptions of reality give us new possibilities of interpretation. The Communist Manifesto is prepared to be reread here. The specter of revolution threatening the West's tranquility is constantly returning with it. Destruction does not necessarily have to accompany revolution. It can come by forgetting it.
Thank you, and we can launch the Q&A session. So we are very excited to have a discussion with you. Yes.
Děkuji. I wish all of you had more time for your reports. And I would like to start with Pavel's points. Well, they're explaining a lot, actually, about the origins of neoliberalism and so on. But I have some problem with this, like with this general Boltanski and Capello, what they write in The New Spirit of Capitalism. 3 years ago, for instance, we brought for our first May demo Alain Krivine, who was one of the student leaders of May 68 in France, and he represents, contrary to Cohn-Bendit, for instance, he represents, and his milieu, the former LCR, now NPA, represents the same ideas, anti-capitalist, revolutionary Marxist, pro-working class, and so on. In general, maybe this generalization notion by Wallerstein of the 68 movements throughout the Eastern and Western Bloc as movements that tried to go beyond the limitations of the gains brought by the old left in both cases, because I think for the grassroots people who participated both in Prague and Paris, socialism and democracy were pretty actual references for their struggle and for their goals. And so I think that this explanation, it makes us think that there was no alternative in 1968, so that the students' movement and the workers' movement in France was inevitably incompatible, and that, actually, the same in Czechoslovakia, that there was actually no viable alternative, and especially after we, Tomáš and Zbyněk mentioned Egon Bondy, Petr Uhl, and Karel Kosik, was there really no genuinely leftist alternative that combined both these strives for more free and more egalitarian society? And was there actually an alternative there to move forward and to deliver an actual revolution?
That's a great question. I mean, it goes directly to the core. Thank you for that. The short answer is that the chapter is closed. The chapter is closed. I don't see any possibility to connect with 68. That's my feeling, right? Of course, you're absolutely right, and I was trying to prevent that or preempt that criticism, that what followed was only a stylized version. I picked up one aspect, okay, of a very infinite or very complex event, and then trajectory, 50 years trajectory after the event. But I think the cases of so one sort of countering your remarks would be to simply say that Daniel Cohn-Bendit is more representative of Parisian 68ers than Alain Krivine, okay? Because of course Alain Krivine was there as well, right? But we could probably to the Czech case, which might be interesting to you, but you probably know that Petr Uhl, for instance, he would be the same story, basically, right? He joined at the end of the 80s, during the Velvet Revolution. He joined the Civic Forum. He was the left wing of the Civic Forum, and then when he first made the journey to Paris after 20 years, he was excluded from the Fourth International exactly because he joined the Civic Forum, which among other things had the program of privatization and marketing, reintroducing market economy and so on and so forth. But he stayed in the Civic Forum and he was excluded from the Fourth International. So this, I think, I want to insist on that what I was talking about was not there were also the cases of the 68ers who went to neoliberalism, but I would distinguish, and I think it is more important to point to Ull's case than other guys who went from, you know, some of those French guys, André Glixman, for instance. He's then joined neoconservatives, or neoliberals, or Bernard Kouchner maybe as well. They are also the same kind of trajectory, but they ended up far more to the right, okay? But I'm more interested in the guys who didn't end up either as neocons or as neoliberals, but he tried to, you know, retain some sort of values. You know, if you talk to Peter now, he would simply say to you that he actually followed this, pursued the same values in '89 as he did in '68, okay? The radical leftists would say, no, it's completely wrong, because you became left-wing liberal, while at that time you were socialist revolutionary, okay? And that was exactly what I was talking about. Okay, now I think you could find all kinds of stories, you know, people who ended up neoliberal, neoconservative, left-wing liberals, the Greens, I mean, if you look at Joschka Fischer, Daniel Cohn-Bendit. Or you can also take Václav Havel. He was not, and it's important to add that he was not a 68er, right? In the Czech context, he would never be classified as a 68er because he was a non-communist, independent writer. But of course, for him, 68 was a very important experience. And he moved, actually, during the 70s, he moved implicitly to the New Left. If you read The Power of Powerless, you will find the passages when he says, we should fight as much bureaucratic Soviet system as the system of infinite capitalist, of infinite accumulation of capital. Okay, our targets are both the managers of the big corporations and the Soviet apparatchik. It's very interesting to read the text, which also celebrates the 50th anniversary, because it was written in 40th anniversary, 10 years after 68. He actually expressed, without using any Marxist rhetoric, he uses the ideas of the New Left, this like neither Soviet system nor bourgeois democracy. We are, you know, for self, there is also an idea of self-government. We don't want to have political parties. So my point was actually even more specific. It would include Havel in that story as well. And the point was, maybe I was not so precise during the presentation, that there was this anti-institutionalist, anti-bureaucratic, anti-state, new left bias, okay? And you could, once the people lost revolutionary utopia, they would simply move to the liberal center, because they would say, okay, we are still against the bureaucratic state, but what's the bureaucratic state in the West? Welfare state, right? So that's deeper point, you know, that there is something more structural, that you could move from anarchist utopia to liberal utopia, to civil society utopia, without embracing capitalism. You could still be critical. All those people were critical. I mean, Daniel Cohn-Bendit would also say that capitalism is the darker side. I also would point to other people, like there was this director of the World Bank, Jonathan Wolfson, or Joseph Stiglitz, the economist. Other guys who wouldn't have probably the 68ers biography, but they were generationally linked to this experience. And again, on the top of the world establishment, we would find people who would suddenly talk about civil society, like Václav Havel, civil society, NGOs as somehow balancing accumulation of capital, you know, or Joseph Stiglitz, who is not neoliberal, you know, he's somebody, so that's what I'm speaking about, and that's the part of the larger story of social democrats becoming left-wing liberals, right? Accepting in their own way there is no alternative slogan, but saying, well, but we somehow have to modify capitalism, right, to make it more human. So I think that's the story. Now we are at the end of the story. I personally cannot really connect to 68, and I will tell you to end it because I'm making lecture, which is my profession. But the last point I would like to say to you is that I was born too late to participate in 68, and in a way also too early to participate in 89. But I did participate in 89 in the Velvet Revolution, and we made some attempts to communicate and you know, ally with the 68ers, with our 68ers, mainly with the former apparatchik. And it was completely impossible, right? Because they really were living in the idea, okay, now it's our again. We will take up our position, which we lost in 68, and we will basically modify the bureaucratic state in the way which will be more human, okay? And the whole, first of all, we couldn't really communicate with them because the apparatchik mind was simply impenetrable to us. We couldn't really communicate with the guys. And the idea that they would simply leave the bureaucratic, oppressive state on the spot, basically. Only modified it in the way as Dubček was doing in the spring 68 was simply too little. So I was placed in the situation, I didn't want to re-privatize or reintroduce capitalistic economy. At the same time, I couldn't really communicate with those guys because I couldn't imagine that the Velvet Revolution would end up as 68, basically, with the leading, because the guys, of course, by 89, they dropped the idea that the party would still be leading, but they still had this idea that somehow Communist Party will be part of the solution. But our Communist Party in Prague was a different one from Gorbachev's Communist Party. It was really, their idea was, okay, we will re-enter the Communist Party, or we will ally with the Communist Party of Jakeš at the time, and we will somehow connect this Communist Party with the Velvet Revolution movement. It didn't function. And then, so, anyway, which is why, from my perspective, it's a closed chapter. So for me, what's much more important is to look in the future, to make this balance sheet, to say what hasn't happened, bygones are bygones. I don't care. No, I care. Of course, know that there are many positive aspects of 68, and I don't deny that. But from the very narrow ideological perspective, that's what has happened. The new left actually in the lower ground won and transformed the left from socialist movement to left-wing liberal movement. So now we are in this situation facing right-wing populism, and we have to find the ways how to construct a new kind of alternative, which would reconnect middle classes, educated middle classes, with the working classes. Because I think that's what didn't happen in 68. It happened only temporarily, and that was the failure. The failure in Prague was simply that Soviet bloc didn't allow this experiments to continue. The failure of Paris 68 was that it was too temporary. It broke up after 2 weeks. Thank you for the question.
I have a question to the editor of Kapitál, the Slovak magazine. You said the mission of the journal is to give voice to disenfranchised and minorities. With the Slovak example of a huge minority of Roma people, for instance, that are often excluded from political life and social processes. How exactly you avoid of the journal like that being an outlet for intellectuals, and how do you make minorities or disenfranchised people to participate in a literary and critical journal like that? Or like, what's your thinking on that, and what's your process on that? Thank you.
Thank you. One of our first issues in was last year, in I think October, November, that was dedicated to Roma memory. I didn't say that because we have every month we have a theme, and like 90% of the texts are dedicated to this one topic. And last year it was Roma memory, and okay, some of the texts were written by intellectuals, but some of them were written by Roma artists, and the whole, I'm sorry I don't have it here because I wasn't in Slovakia recently, but the issue about Roma memory was illustrated by Roma artists. Every issue is illustrated by different people, Slovak artists, Czech ones, and so on, so on. These were British Roma artists, Daniel Baker, and another one. So that's part of the giving voice, like giving them a visual voice and also verbal voice. That was the Roma memory. And then, for example, in April we had an issue dedicated to those called other bodies, and it was dedicated to people with disabilities and different sexual orientation and so on, transgender people. And I think now, I don't have the number, but I would say about 60–70% of the texts were written by the people. For example, we had like 6–7 texts by transgender people, saying how was the whole operation, how they are perceived, how is Czech sexuology dealing with this issue. Then we had texts by people who are disabled, and we published their diaries and so on. So for us, this is one way of giving the voice.
No. Can I just little bit continue the topic of the first question? How it appears to be that we are so actually disconnected. Well, just you to understand, all these people who gather on these cultural events in the center from Visual Culture Research Center, they're brilliant activists. And when it was Maidan here, most of them was not doing just some theoretical conferences. They all were on the streets. They were all actively participating in some events in this mass mobilization. But today, for example, it's a general strike in one of the major industrial cities of Ukraine. It's a 1 million strong, big city with a huge, well, approximately a little bit less than a million, okay, but with huge metallurgical enterprises, with huge mines and so on. There are some people with machine guns, some clashes among protesters and strike breakers, and something is going on in this country. But, well, actually, nobody is interested in it. We are just doing our job, discussing the revolution in English, proclaiming the introductory word by the head of the VCRC, Comrade Cherepani. It was just brilliant. But I'm not sure that he will ever do such a brilliant speech in Ukrainian. I heard it several times in English, but I don't hear it in Ukrainian. And so why it happens? Why all these interventions of intellectuals are so focused on kind of civil civil society issues, human rights issues, but why we all are so afraid of class issues? Actually, the things are going very bad in Ukraine. Yes, we have far-right terror actually against left wings. We have some left political parties prohibited. It was bad parties, but nevertheless, we don't have kind of really legal left party open. All left parties have some not firm legal status actually, and but when we can see terror against some left-wingers of trade union activists, well, it mostly not that loud, yes, but when we see the real pogrom of Roms, yes, some progressive artists do the public mobilization and so on, and it is very good that they are doing such things, but somehow, and I don't really understand, maybe you can comment on this, how it happens that all class issues are so removed from our mind, that we are trying to see each thing as kind of something else. This is my question. Thank you.
That's great. You said it all. I mean, I could say the same story to depict very similar story for the situation in the Czech Republic, basically. It would be very, very similar story that you have these intelligentsia people who were raised on the discourse of civil society, human rights, and humanitarianism, right? And they would always feel solidarity with immigrants coming, or with Roma people, with disabled people, with LGBT community, which is very good, I agree with you. They would have no idea about the problems of the working class people in the North Bohemia or North Moravia, which are, you know, unemployed people, and the Czech Republic is actually not that bad on that respect, but still we have people, the Czech people, not Roma people, who are unemployed, and nobody really, you know, there is no class, or I don't know, but I think so. The story, so it perfectly dovetailed to my story. I think partly this is the result of the rise of this 68 generation, which abandoned class discourse, abandoned the criticism of capitalism, and replaced that by human rights, humanitarianism, civil society discourse. It's exact. So I think this would be the deeper now, and I completely agree that how to make this enlightened elite, cultivated middle class people, whose values I embrace. I also am for human rights and civil society, but I also think that there is a class issue here, and there should be some connection between those values and class issue, and, you know, the interests of unemployed and less educated who belong to the national majority, not to all those, because this minoritarian discourse was also the result of the 70s, 80s. Instead of working class, we have those other victims, disabled people, Roma, ethnic minority, and so on and so forth. So I think we would agree on that. So now the challenge would be how somehow to transform, because I'm not ready to abandon the idea of human rights, for instance, or the idea of rights for disabled people and against the discrimination against minorities. So I feel the challenge is simply how to reconnect it with the class issue and with those more traditional leftist concerns. Yeah.
I have two questions, one for Tomáš and one for Pavel. I do the first for Tomáš, which is shorter. I'm agree that it's a pity that you did not have more time to explain the proposal, and this is why I would like you in time to give you more time in answering my question. But one thing I would like to know, in order and that was exactly your last point when you did not have time to develop, I'm not quite really understood what exactly the project that those people, you know, that are linked with the journalist Kapitál are developing. So maybe I will, in order to give me maybe a clearer idea, I would like to know, for instance, how you locate yourself with respect to what might be similar movement in other countries. For instance, Razem in Poland, you know what Razem, Agnes, or in Slovenia, Levica, probably I pronounce badly, but those are, how can I, well, they are movement which like Podemos in Spain. You probably have heard about Podemos more than Razem or Levica, no? Who are trying precisely to develop the kind of project which Pavel was saying we are missing. So I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about or you envisage what kind of political project, if at all you've got one. In fact, with respect with Pavel, it's more a comment than a question, because I basically agree to what you said. I totally agree that Cohn-Bendit is much more representative than Krivin than for 68. But I think you are in fact a bit too generous for Cohn-Bendit and those people to say that they move to some kind of left-wing social liberalism. I don't see where is the left wing in there. I think it's just pure social liberalism. And for instance, if we know that today Cohn-Bendit and another 68er like Romain Goupil are total supporter of Macron, I mean, what's left in Macron? I mean, so that's just a little point. I would be more critical of that. But what I'm interested here is in fact saying, I don't think that we should see the evolution of those people too much in terms of individual strategy. I think it's important also to realize that I think, for instance, that more traditional left parties are in great part responsible for the fact that they evolve in that way. And the first person who intervened made reference to the book by Wolfgang Kyiv, probably is read it in a completely different way as I have, because I'm much more positive with respect to that. But I think it's a very interesting book. It has been interpreted wrongly, to my mind, by a series of people who accused them, saying that they're criticizing them for, they say that they accuse the 68 for being responsible for the development of neoliberalism. You know? So I think that, and in fact I've discussed this issue in a chapter of my book Agonistic, because I made a completely different reading of that. I say that what they show is that in fact capitalism was able to take advantage. You know, in fact it's a phenomenon that Gramsci called a passive revolution, or in fact a revolution by the neutralization. There is also a term, the situationist thinks of détournement. It's a classical things of détournement, because they have appropriated the demand of the 68. Well, basically the question of culture, you know, because, for instance, I think that Boltanski and Chapello, in fact, made a mistake to call that artistic critique. They say that opposed the artistic critique to the social critique. And of course, a lot of people interpreted, so they accuse the artists who are responsible. This is not at all what they meant. What they meant by artistic critique is the counter-cultural critique that was central in 68, and that they really is very interesting to see that in terms of détournement. They use that in order to satisfy those demands, but in a way that was taking completely away the subversive things, you know. So they were able, and what they were able to do that, I think, is because the traditional left did not take account of those demands. They just and you know, I was involved in the feminist movement and I know very well, for instance, or when you were speaking about art, they will say, oh, those are petit bourgeois demands, you know, or the best, they will say, oh yeah, that's important, but you know, let's build socialism first, and then so I've seen that there was no receptivity at all from the traditional left for those kind of demands. So they were demands which were, you know, they available for appropriation by capitalism. So this is what happened, and I think that's what it's clear in the book by Chapello and Boltanchi. Another point that goes into the same direction also and again, that relates to a point that you made this time in your answer. I think that, for instance, the rise of neoliberalism in Western Europe, that was the moment, of course, is Thatcherism. Well, the Thatcherism was able to establish its neoliberal hegemony because the Labour Party was completely leaving aside the series of critique to its collectivism, its bureaucratism, because when you are saying something that people who were, well, of course, it's different in Soviet, you know, well, not Soviet, but post the East countries, let's call them like that, because, but there was also in well, the case of Britain, which is the one, you know, where I'm living, and I know, and I work best, and I think it's paradigmatic, because the welfare state, which was something, of course, a victory for the workers and very positive, was experienced by the very people who were, you know, and by that, as something oppressive. Because it was organized in a collectivist way. So, for instance, you had an employment benefit, but you had to go and queue for ages for that, and people there were treating you badly. So, the very people who were favorable by that were seeing it as oppressive. And then, of course, when Thatcher came and told them that I'm going to give you freedom, I'm going to liberate you from the oppressive state, it worked. And you know, it's important to realize that, in fact, a quite important part of the working class in Britain became Thatcherite. Because, and also in that case, there was a quite interesting strategy of Thatcher of détournement with respect to the way she managed to win over a sector of the working class, for instance, was to say, oh yeah, I do understand your complaint, but you know, the problem are the feminists. It's the feminists who are responsible for unemployment because they want to get job, and or it's the immigrants. You know, so she was able, by dividing what should have been, there should have been an union between all those demands, but she was able to divide them. And the Labour Party at that moment, and I remember it was really, you know, incredible. There was, oh, this Thatcher is not going to Labour to allow, because when unemployment will reach 1 million, then the people are going to revolt, and then the unemployment reach more and more. And in the meantime, Thatcher was establishing the hegemony, and so I think that, you know, this is really also, it's too easy to say, oh, people, you know, when abandon their ideas. No, I think that there is some more structural things. The fact that the traditional left was not able to take account of all those demands, which are important. And this is why, in fact, coming to Laďa, I think today we are in a moment which is very important, because we cannot, I personally believe that we are in Western Europe living a crisis of neoliberalism, and that it's very important not to repeat the mistake that the left did, you know, 30 years ago, and to be able to really articulate the different demands. So I totally agree with you when you say that, you know, it's a question now is to say, oh, we are going to articulate the demand of the working class and the middle classes. And of course, the middle classes are in great part, not exclusively, they are also have got economic questions, but all those more so-called societal issues are important for the middle class. So it's really a question of how to articulate them, and, you know, to make a little bit of publicity for. But this is precisely what I call left populism, and this is what I'm arguing for in the book that I've just finished. Thank you.
Because I completely agree with that. Also, I thank you that you complimented my picture, because of course my picture was putting the blame one-sidedly on the new left side, right? And you pointed out that there was the old left, which was completely, you know, they didn't simply react. There was no possible communication, and I think it's important to revisit that debate, not to idealize 6P, to evoke it commemoratively as something which should be reconnect as an event, but rather to revisit this failure in order to overcome that, to make a second trial. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I will try to answer it and at the same time maybe comment at the question that was asked before. Because I must say I agree with Pavel that of course the left now embraced more the human rights and minorities than the class issues. But in this case you must understand that in Slovakia being called the leftist is an insult. There is no leftist party and almost no leftist media. I know of two of them who deal with class issues. They are websites called Carmina and Pole, and they are visited by very few people. It's also strange, it's a couple of leftist intellectuals writing about workers' conditions and so on, but mainly read by them. You know, it is just, I would say it's about, I don't know, 50 people reading it. It's not much. So what we are trying to do, yes, we are exactly where Pavel said, we are embracing more the human rights issues and so on, but at the same time, slowly giving space to class issues. For example, in this one about Marx, you have an article, an article about class problems, and you have a couple of more political texts in this one. So what we are trying to do is build a whole project around what you would call maybe left-wing liberal issues. But even that is a problem in Slovakia, you know. Being openly socialist or leftist, that's going too far. Nobody even pays attention. First, you must start with these issues. Even they are problematic, but you start with them. That's my point of view. And then slowly, you put more pressure onto social problems and class issues. We are preparing, for example, this year there will be an issue on housing and one on education, and this will deal more with these problems, and we'll ask the different people from some philosophers and some people, especially the voice of those people, to be heard. But I think in Slovakia this is a long run thing. That's my feeling from the country. So I would say now we are on a left-wing, if you would call it political, left-wing liberal, tending slowly to tackle other issues as well.
I have a question to Tomáš about the murder of Jan in Czech and about the protest. A few years ago, we also had a murder of a prominent journalist, Pavel in the center of Kyiv, near from here. He was killed and still there is no information who was involved, but allegedly and according to some journalistic investigation, the government or special services were involved somehow. So, didn't lead to some protests or some kind of this. How it happened that in your case it led to mass protests? I mean, exactly this what was the leading organizations or trigger for this?
That's the funny thing about it. I don't think that the murder really was the case, or the connection of mafia to we are still not sure that there is a connection of mafia to the political elite. There are only suggestions, very strong suggestions. But I think what led people into the streets was very, very long suppressed frustration with the government that's been going on for 8 years. So there was a lot of problems, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think the murder was just the last thing that triggered it. It was not about the case of the murder. It could be something similar, because really people had enough. But that's my point. Like, people have enough, but well, they just stand there and say we have enough, but I don't have any real suggestions how to change this enough.
So if there are no more questions, maybe we can leave them for private talks for later. So we will stay around, and if you have any questions or comments, you can tell us informally after the panel. And thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.